what exactly the jury is going to be deciding on here. There's two parts. Let's start with the falsifying of records part.
Right. So the falsified records deals with the transactions that were the payments made to Michael Cohen, Stormy Daniels, all those transactions, how they broke them up, how they structured them.
That originated from the Trump organization.
Correct.
That were labeled as legal services and that were used to keep Stormy Daniels quiet ahead of the 2016 election.
Right. So the payment to Stormy Daniels came out of that shell company that basically his home equity line of credit that Michael Cohen set up or tapped into in order to pay her.
The reimbursement.
The reimbursement is what is the heart of this argument in the case. So
and Trump is saying, look, Michael Cohen billed me for legal services. I didn't know what the money was going for. The prosecution saying you absolutely knew what the money was going for. It was going to keep Stormy Daniels quiet. So after the Access Hollywood tape came out in 2016, this allegation doesn't come out and ruin your chances at winning the election. That's essentially the falsifying of business records part. Normally, that would just be a misdemeanor.
Correct.
And normally, maybe you would bring a case like this. Probably.
And they're more common in New York from what I've all the reporting I've heard, because New York's a huge financial institution.
Yeah.
So they deal with this more commonly in the business transactions up there because you can get all sorts of tax breaks or by mislabeling something or intentionally labeling something that it wasn't. It could be say it's just donating to charity when you weren't. So, those are more common examples.
That's the correct legal answer. I'm going to say this case would have been brought if it wasn't Donald Trump and all the details on the falsifying business records were the same. But regardless, now we move on to the second part. It's the reasoning behind the falsifying of the business records. This is the part that would make it a felony.
Right.
It's in furtherance of another crime.
Correct.
And the prosecution didn't have to prove the other crime. They didn't even have to really detail it, right? They just alluded to it.
Right.
And it was another crime, like in the campaign finance violation. That's essentially what they're saying. It's a campaign finance violation because that money was used to help his campaign by keeping that story quiet and not impacting the election. But that also comes after previous DA in Manhattan chose not to go after Trump on those specific charges, and the Department of Justice decided not to go after him on those specific charges. But the furtherance of another crime, that's the intent part that the prosecution has to prove. That's what would make it a felony.
Correct. And that's what they spent a lot of time, with Stormy Daniels and Michael Cohen explaining that, walking through that with David Pecker. So it was a whole cavalcade of people that came forward, and they all put something to the story. And the meat of the story was that Donald Trump he had his hands on everything. And the most fascinating part of the trial testimony I found is the whole FedExing of the checks from Trump Tower to the White House, so Donald Trump could sign the checks physically, on his own. If he wasn't still in running the organization, then he said, I turned it all over to Don and Eric, and I'm out of it. Ivanka's coming with me to the White House.
Yeah.
But clearly he was still doing the business of the Trump organization while he was in office. And I can just only imagine, imagine getting you're opening up the mail. It's FedEx from Trump Tower, and there's 6 checks for $50,000 each, and then having to go take them to him, and then getting them back up to New York to Trump Tower in order to give them to whoever they're going to. I think that was probably their strongest evidence that he knew what was going. Their prosecution's argument was that he knew what was going on when it was going on and setting up the hush money payment.
And the defense is saying he was just handed these checks. He didn't know what the hell was going on. Right. He was president at the time. He was,
right. He was solving problems in the Middle East and all that sort of stuff.
Right. Okay. And the options now, what could come out of the deliberations?
So it's going to be interesting because I'm not a betting person. I don't like to predict verdicts, as you know.
Oh,
you
yeah.
always
you never do.
Ding me for that. But I think it's probably going to be an all or nothing, because I think since all the counts are kind of you have the 11 checks, those are separate charges, but then you have the falsified, business records and all that sort of stuff. So I think if you fine for one, I think you fine for all the rest of them.
Okay.
I don't know. They could split the baby and say we believe these checks were falsified, but not to the level of the campaign finance or another violation. But I think the way that they presented it, it's like, okay, he did it this way, this way, this way, this way, all 34 times the same way.
And again, there's no chance, because this was agreed upon between the two parties, no chance that some of the falsifying of business records, the misdemeanor charges could be, what Trump's found guilty of, and not the felony stuff. It's felony or
it's
nothing.
all or nothing. Yeah, and that's what I think. The prosecution wanted it that way, and I think the defense, like I talked about earlier, typically the defense would ask for a lesser included.
Mm-hmm.
They did not want that. They want a clean slate, and not guilty all the way.
And finally, you could have the guilty verdict, you could have a not guilty verdict, or you could have a hung jury.
And that's everyone's, I think, fear in this.
It's just a juror or two or three or whatever. And
it only takes one, and that's what they were hunting for throughout the entire defense case, is getting to that one juror that would say, you know what, I really don't like this, and all the other 11 could say he's absolutely guilty. You don't reach a verdict, then it's hung, and then the question becomes, do you try it all over again?
Yeah,
and do you have time to do that before the election?
No. Right.